Welcome back. I first like to say thanks to all of you that watched my first episode. The outpouring of support and kind words mean a lot. In this episode of my prog rock show, I'd like to delve into a specific album, Pawn Hearts by Graaf Generator, right after this. Let's start off with a brief history of the band. The embryonic form of Graaf Generator started at Manchester University in 1967, taking the name from Robert van de Graaff, an American physicist who created high-voltage generators. Vocalist and songwriter Peter Hamel was the nucleus of the group, as musicians were in and out of the band. Hugh Batten would join as the organist and introduced Hamel to Tony Stratton Smith, who would manage the band from that point on. Mercury Records released Graaf Generator's first album, The Aerosol Gray Machine, in 1969, only to the United States, resulting in very little fanfare since they were almost completely unheard of in the U.S. Record companies. Tony Stratton Smith, fed up with record labels, formed his own label called Charisma Records, initially signing bands like The Nice, Rare Bird, Monty Python, and eventually Genesis. In February of 1970, Graaf released their sophomore album, and first under the new label titled The Least We Can Do Is Wave to Each Other. It received warm reviews and some notable sales. The lineup would settle into the classic four-piece consisting of Hugh Batten on keyboards, Peter Hamel on vocals, Guy Evans on drums, and David Jackson on saxophones and woodwinds. Virtually a stringless band. The following album, H2HE, Who Am the Only One, was released in December of 1970. During this time, Graaf was headlining a tour with Genesis and Lindisfarne called the Six Bob Tour, hence its cheap ticket sales to bring in more people and ultimately sell more albums. What I would give to be on that tour bus with those bands. This brings us to the album I want to talk about, Pawn Hearts. In May of 1971, Graaf Generator's fourth album began taking shape while touring in Germany. 3 songs would make up the entirety of the album: Lemmings, Mannerg, and A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers. In June and July of 1971, the group rehearsed at their manager Tony Stratton Smith's supposedly haunted house. The recording sessions for Pawn Hearts went from July to September at Trident Studios between live engagements. For the 4th time, John Anthony was sitting at the controls as their producer. For 1971, this was a technologically groundbreaking album. They were throwing in every possible idea, including sound effects, backwards tapes, and psychedelic razors. What is a psychedelic razor? I don't think that was it. Even though John Anthony had produced Queen, Genesis, The Tubes, and Roxy Music, Pawn Hearts remains the most beautiful thing he ever recorded or ever will, in his opinion. I'd like to briefly examine each individual song that makes up the album. Lemmings, including Cog, kicks off the album and clocks in at 11 minutes and 23 seconds. Just as the title suggests, it is about lemmings trying to convince an observer that jumping into the sea is the only way, and if you have ever had a conversation with lemmings, you would know that these lyrics are spot on. The music shifts with the moods as it starts soft, then building in intensity before breaking into absolute chaos. The observer eventually rejects the lemmings' approach to life and lives on another day, but the lasting impressions of the lemmings are reflected in the end of this song. Mannerg, the second song on the album, clocks in at 10 minutes and 22 seconds and completes the first side of the album. The title is a play on words for the phrase horsepower. The song explores the duality of good and evil lurking within all of us. Again, the song starts off with a beautiful melody, but then a few minutes into the music takes a left turn into madness as the individual questions their identity. The individual realizes that he is a man and that if all walks of life can exist in the world, then the killer and angel can coexist within himself. Lastly, A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers clocks in at a whopping 23 minutes and 13 seconds, consuming all of side B and consisting of 10 parts. The listener is placed in the mind of a lighthouse keeper that is haunted by the ghost of shipwrecks he witnessed as a helpless bystander. So what happens to the lighthouse keeper? Peter Hamill actually left it up to the listener to decide. A whole video could be made about one song, with all the changes that occur throughout.
It should also be noted that guitarist Robert Fripp from King Crimson made his second appearance on a Graaf Generator album for Pawn Hearts, previously contributing to H2HE, Who Am the Only One. Originally, Pawn Hearts was imagined as a 4-sided LP. The first 2 sides were as the album was released, while side 3 would feature solo compositions from Hugh, David, and Guy. Guy's Angle of Incidence, David's Ponkers theme, and Hugh's Diminution would eventually show up as bonus tracks on the 2005 remaster. Side 4 was supposed to have live versions of Killers and Octopus from their previous album, H2HE, Who Am the Only One. So what happened when Pawn Hearts was released on October of 1971?
Didn't sell. Critics didn't exactly know what to think. Melody Maker gave the album one of its better reviews, calling Pawn Hearts fascinating and dramatic. However, Sounds called the album a disappointment, and Record Mirror admitted ignorance as to what the band was doing. Listeners must have had a similar reaction because low sales prevented the album from cracking the top 100 on the British charts.
You can't talk about Pawn Hearts without talking about Theme 1, a song originally written by Beatles producer Sir George Martin for BBC Radio 1. It was recorded and released as a single in February of 1972. Much to the chagrin of singer Peter Hamill, it was placed between Lemmings and Mannerg on the US release of Pawn Hearts, which breaks up the feel of the album since Theme 1 is much more upbeat than anything on the album.
Record companies.
Although George Martin was an admirer of the version, the single failed to chart in England.
But in a positive turn of events, during the same month, both the album Pawn Hearts and the single Theme 1 went to number 1 on the Italian charts, prompting a tour in Italy. Unfortunately, increasing frustration, mounting debt, and dwindling support from the record company caused the band to break up. On August 6th of 1972, the band had played their final gig, at least for a while. Although this was the end of a chapter for the band, it was not the end of the story. In 1975, they would reform for their album God Bluff, but that is a story for another time. Let's delve into the packaging of the original vinyl.
The title Pawn Hearts came about by accident when saxophonist David Jackson said, "I'll go to the studio and dub on some porn hearts." I'm trying to keep this family friendly there, David. He was trying to say horn parts. So this evolved into Pawn Hearts. It didn't hurt that Peter Hamill had an affinity for playing chess, as you will see from the artwork on his first solo album. Shakespeare once wrote, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players." That is precisely what artist Paul Whitehead illustrated on the outer cover of Pawn Hearts. Whitehead was originally introduced to the band through their producer John Anthony and was commissioned for the cover painting. At this point, he had already painted the cover for H2HE and singer Peter Hamill's first solo album, Fool's Mate. Notice the chess theme. The idea for Pawn Hearts came to Paul after listening to A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers. Paul then incorporated the idea of the pawn chess piece as well as the central theme of the album, that we as people are no more than a pawn, or perhaps even a cog, in a much larger machine which is beyond our comprehension, no matter our social class. The outer cover consists of an Earth-like stage with clouds representing the stage curtain. The players consisted of historical figures, people of different professions, religious leaders, and even an alien. If you look closely at it, you can spot the likes of John Lennon, Winston Churchill, as well as Jesus. Is that my accountant? Each person is encased in a pawn piece, which also looks similar to a lighthouse.
Coincidence?
So why all the recognizable people on the cover? Paul had also been inspired by old cigarette cards from tobacco manufacturers produced between the late 1800s and the 1940s that depicted actors, actresses, and baseball players. The finished product is definitely one of the finest examples of a marriage between music and imagery. I recommend visiting www.paulwhitehead.com to view many examples of his art. Trust me, you will not be disappointed. Signed prints of Paul's artwork can be purchased, as well as clothing for Graaf Generator, Genesis, and other bands Paul contributed artwork to.
Let's take a look at the inside of the cover. Oh boy.
The controversial inner cover depicts saxophonist David Jackson standing firmly on the ground, giving a Nazi salute while the other three members stand atop a table, returning the gesture. This was taken during the rehearsals by photographer Keith Morris, who used infrared film, which explains the strange colors. Monty Python-like humor comes into play, inspired by the mini statues they saw while on tour in Germany that paid homage to stormtroopers from World War II. Jackson admitted that this was a result of being young and silly, but in hindsight, perhaps it probably wasn't funny, nor did it do them any real favors.
I had some misgivings about focusing on Pawn Hearts for my second video. As much as I love this album, this might not be everyone's cup of tea. Fortunately, Pawn Hearts has aged extremely well, and history has corrected itself. Time and time again, musical innovation can be met with apprehension, and Pawn Hearts has been no exception. The album would go on to be held as a masterpiece, especially amongst prog rock fans. On progarchives.com, Pawn Hearts currently ranks at number 12 among thousands of progressive rock albums rated by the listeners. The album has also made it to many critics' polls throughout the years. It has received praise from several fellow musicians, including the god of hellfire himself, Arthur Brown, from The Crazy World of Arthur Brown, in which Graaf Generator had been admirers of. Pawn Hearts may not be the feel-good album of 1971 and can certainly take the listener to some dark places. However, there is nothing wrong with a collection of music that makes the listener think not only about the turmoils of society, but also their own internal struggles. Yes, the theme of falling in love is nowhere to be heard on this album, and it is better off for it. But is the album really that dark? Lemmings and Mannerg actually have positive resolutions, and Lighthouse is open for interpretation. Regardless of the themes of the album, the musicianship and production are stellar. Lastly, there is nothing remotely close to Peter Hamill's voice. Many people emulated the voices of Yes's John Anderson and Genesis's Peter Gabriel, but no one sounded quite like Peter Hamill.
So is Pawn Hearts the greatest Graaf Generator album? One positive attribute of the band is that you can argue a case for 3 or 4 of their albums.
I also wanted to mention that I recently got the opportunity to listen to the most current release of Pawn Hearts mixed in surround sound by Stephen W. Taylor.
I have heard this album many, many times, and listening to it in 5.1 surround sound was like hearing it for the first time. The instruments were spaced out and much more intense. Every emotion that Peter Hamill conveyed with his vocals could be felt, giving a lot more depth to the themes in the album. The best part was hearing sounds and nuances I had never heard before in regular stereo. I highly recommend listening to Pawn Hearts in surround if you get the opportunity.
If you haven't listened to Graaf Generator's Pawn Hearts at all, then give it a spin. If you have, then listen to it again. And I urge you to purchase it, whether it be by CD, vinyl, or even download. Let me know what you think of Pawn Hearts in the comments section below. I've only scratched the surface of Pawn Hearts in the interest of keeping the video a reasonable length. To learn more about the band or the album, take a look at my list of sources. If you have enjoyed what you have watched, then please give this video a like and subscribe. If you don't like it, then you are more than welcome to exercise your freedoms and give it a dislike. Thank you for watching.